Hello, my name is Tim Pratico, and today I'll be talking about Fragile X syndrome. So just a outline of the presentation. First, I'll discuss the history and the discovery of Fragile X syndrome. I'll move on from there to a discussion of the inheritance pattern and the affected gene that causes Fragile X. From there, I'll go into the symptoms of Fragile X, discuss treatment options and attempts at a cure, and then finish up with a discussion of personal, business, and political significance of Fragile X. In terms of the history of the disorder, in 1943, Julia Bell and James Martin published the paper A Pedigree of Mental Defect Showing Sex Linkage, and in this paper they discussed a London area family that had a total of 11 males across 2 generations exhibiting symptoms of mental retardation. Through interviews with those affected and a detailed studying of the family's history, Bell and Martin ultimately did determine that the condition seen in the family was both sex-linked and heritable, and they suggested that the disorder was inherited from the X chromosome of a mother carrying the X-linked trait of her affected father. Initially, they coined this Martin-Bell syndrome, though the name was eventually changed to Fragile X. So, as was mentioned prior, the Fragile X syndrome is inherited by way of an X-linked dominant pattern in which the mutated gene that causes the disorder is on the X chromosome, and only one copy of the altered gene is needed to cause a condition. Due to the X-linked nature of this disorder, males are generally more adversely affected by Fragile X as they only have one X chromosome to be affected and therefore have the mutation in their one and only copy of the disease-causing gene. This does partially explain why Fragile X is the most common hereditary cause of mental disability in boys, with 1 in every 4,000 boys affected. Additionally, the inheritance pattern of Fragile X is also with anticipation, which is when the signs and symptoms of a genetic condition tend to become more severe and appear at an earlier age as the disorder is passed from generation to generation in a family. As a result of this anticipatory nature of Fragile X syndrome inheritance, each subsequent generation within a family is more adversely affected by the disorder than the previous one. So in terms of the genetic cause of Fragile X, nearly all cases of Fragile X are caused by a mutation in the FMR1 gene. When functioning properly, this gene is essential for normal cognitive development as well as female reproductive function. Generally speaking, in the FMR1 gene, there is a CGG triplet repeat of about 5 to 40 times, though in the case of those with Fragile X syndrome, this triplet is repeated over 200 times. And due to this expanding triplet repeat, the FMR1 gene is silenced and rendered unable to produce the Fragile X mental retardation protein. As a result of this silenced protein, the symptoms of Fragile X are exhibited. Additionally, people can have what is referred to as a Fragile X premutation, and that is considered to be an intermediate variation in the FMR1 gene and occurs in people with a slightly above average number of CGG triplet repeats. In this case, it's about 55 to 200. Women with the premutation have an increased risk of their child developing Fragile X, while men do not have this increased risk. Although normal in both intellectual abilities and appearance, those with the premutation generally may have learning disabilities or social anxiety. There's also health risks associated with the premutation, as female carriers have an increased risk of premature menopause, and male carriers are at a risk of a syndrome named Fragile X tremor syndrome, in which a tremor gets developed and becomes increasingly worse over time. So the existence of this intermediate variation in the FMR1 gene kind of illustrates the anticipatory nature of the inheritance pattern, as those with a moderate number of triplet repeats have slightly lessened symptoms compared to those with the disorder full out. So speaking of the symptoms of people with Fragile X, they're fairly consistent with the symptoms displayed by those people with autism. And they can be broken down into 5 categories: intelligence and learning, physical and behavioral, social, speech and language, and sensory. So in terms of intelligence and learning symptoms, Fragile X patients do have mental retardation with anything from moderate learning disorders to severe developmental disabilities possible. Physically speaking, those with Fragile X typically do not have any physical defects at a young age, though once puberty does begin, they often develop a narrow face, large head, large ears, flexible joints, and a prominent forehead, which generally gets worse as aging continues, and that is pictured on this slide off to the right. Behaviorally and socially, Fragile X leads to fear, anxiety, trouble making eye contact, aggressiveness, hyperactivity, and attention issues. Speech and language-wise, boys are usually the most affected in this realm and have trouble speaking clearly. They have a stutter and an inability to understand social cues related to language. Additionally, language development is usually later in people with Fragile X, and some may stay nonverbal for their entire life. Lastly, there are sensory issues displayed by those with Fragile X, exhibited by irritation caused by bright lights, loud noises, or how certain clothing feels on their body, which can lead to outbursts and behavioral problems. These symptoms are generally noticed by parents early on, and then they proceed to go to a doctor, and the typical age of diagnosis is 36 months for boys and 42 months for girls. So in terms of treatment options, the unfortunate truth is that there is no cure at this time. There's no single treatment suggested, and instead patients are evaluated on a case-by-case basis and given a customized treatment plan to put them in the best position going forward. And this could consist of certain medications, therapy services, and educational provisions, and that would give them the best chance to maximize their potential with this disorder. Recently, there have been some strives to make a cure. Scientists have been studying the MGLUR theory, which suggested that exaggerated signaling in the metabotropic glutamine receptor pathways led to the symptoms of Fragile X. There were promising experiments on mice in pursuit of this theory, and then the biotechnology company Novartis did a clinical trial of a similar treatment on adolescents with Fragile X, though unfortunately the 2014 trial did not produce a positive result, and the study did not meet the goal of showing significant improvement in the abnormal behavior of those with Fragile X, though they did state that the trial did not rule out the validity of the mGLUR5 theory, and in the future this theory will continue to be investigated. So personally, why I chose this disorder, there's a family from my hometown that has a history of Fragile X, and just seeing how the other family members have had to really work to help those affected get through their day-to-day lives, and also all the initiatives that need to happen at school for the students to be put in a solid learning environment. It really just interested me in this disease to learn more about it, so that's why I decided to look into this. In terms of business impacts, advocate groups have a large effect on the motor industry specifically. Recently, they took to Washington, D.C. and in pursuit of support of the Self-Drive Act, which would give government money to the development of self-driving cars that could be used by those with Fragile X in areas where public transportation is inadequate. So if that act was passed, the automotive industry would be drastically impacted as companies would race to develop the best and safest self-driving cars, and in turn provide people with Fragile X with peace of mind when traveling. Additionally, of course, there's the possibility of substantial profits for the first company to develop a successful treatment for Fragile X. Novartis and other companies are currently racing to do that, and I'm sure the advocate groups would be very willing to pay handsomely if there was a cure discovered. And then societally, again, the advocate groups are showing a lot of influence over politics. Again, when they were in Washington, D.C. this past March, they were supporting the RISE Act, which would allow individuals with Fragile X to qualify for special services in colleges. So again, they are really flexing their muscles on the political realm as well as the business realm. And that is all I have. Thank you for watching.